The fastest way to lose money as a new landlord is just one bad tenant. Today, I'm sitting down with Travis Anderson, a Twin Cities realtor who has owned many rental properties over the years. And he wants to walk you through the biggest mistakes a new landlord can make and how to avoid them. Hey, I'm Peter Lindquist. I've been a mortgage lender here in Minnesota for over 30 years. I asked Travis to walk through 10 practical things every landlord should know, like how to set rent the right way, how to attract great tenants, how to avoid evictions, and even some state laws that you really need to pay attention to as a new landlord. If you're thinking about turning your home into a rental or buying your first investment property, this is going to save you some stress, time, and money. Travis, for the brand new landlord, things can get kind of overwhelming sometimes. What should they really focus on at first?
Yeah, I think the first thing would just be screening for a good tenant. You get a bad tenant in there, it can cost you rent, can cost you maintenance. And so a really good background check, verifying employment debts, things of that nature, screening tenants, I think, would be the number one thing I'd focus on.
How should a landlord know what they should charge for rent?
Yeah, I think probably the best way, Peter, would be just to act as if you are a renter looking for a place to rent in your community. And so look on good websites like Hotpads or Zillow, and then see how your home would compare. And then do the opposite of what you think you should do as a landlord, and then price it as if you're a renter going to get the best place. So price it below what you're competing with so that you don't waste market time, because obviously not collecting rent is a costly mistake.
Is there any thought to, I've seen some landlords under rent their place by $200 or $300 because they just want to get somebody fast. Is there some dangers to that too?
Yeah, the only danger is just not catching up at some point, because obviously you do have a return on your investment. And so if $200, for example, is $2,400 a year, and over the course of a handful of years, that can really add up. And so that's probably the biggest problem with that. But again, I do think keeping your rents like at the market value or just slightly below the market value is going to keep your property rented. So that's actually the strategy that we generally use. And then when you get good tenants, you're kind of maintaining their rent, maybe raising it a little bit here and there so you can keep that good tenant in there.
What kind of updates to the dwelling should a landlord do in order to maximize their rent?
Yeah, for sure. We like to do fresh paint, flooring, and light fixtures is sort of like the basics that we would do before we turn it over as a rental. And then from there, you're just looking at improvements that might raise the rent. So like a kitchen improvement or bathroom improvement, something like that. And then lastly, we like to look at the curb appeal. But tenants do like homes that look nice. But at a minimum, it's got to have fresh paint, really nice flooring or decent flooring, and then good lighting and things like that.
Is it better for a landlord to manage it themselves or to hire a rental management company?
Yeah, all of my stuff is managed by me. I do think most people should start there at a minimum and then start looking to hire out once you get so much rentals that you can't manage it. In other words, once the stress outweighs the cost, because there's a pretty good cost to hiring a company, and you're still going to get calls from someone when something breaks. It's just not going to be your tenant. And so um, I think managing it ourselves is a little bit easier. Or it's cheaper, obviously. One thing to think about is that some management companies have in-house maintenance. That can be a benefit where you're paying maybe a lesser labor rate than you would get in the open market.
What should a new landlord know about Minnesota specific laws or just laws in general as a landlord that they should pay attention to?
Yeah, the first one would be that you can't discriminate, Peter. And I think that sort of makes sense at face value, but I'm going to give you an example. If you were to live in your home, you actually can discriminate. So let's say I'm a single mother, for example, and I'm renting out one of my extra bedrooms. I might not want a man living in the house with me and my kids. And so you can discriminate. You can choose young women, for example, to rent to. So if you're living in the home, discrimination laws kind of go out the window. But once you move out and you're renting a home in total, then you can't discriminate in any way, and that includes like marital status. So you couldn't choose a tenant, for example, because they're single, would be sort of, kind of that marital status piece. And then the other thing is that Minnesota is very favoring to the renter. So if you do get a bad tenant and you have to evict them, number one, you're going to lose the rental income usually. The number one reason for eviction would be lack of payment. And so you're going to be losing that monthly income. But then also it's costly to evict in Minnesota.
What's the smartest way a new landlord should handle maintenance requests? The toilet explodes. How should they handle that?
Yeah, I'm super fortunate because in my instance, I'm super handy. I like working on houses, and so generally speaking, I'm making most of those repairs myself, all of the way up to like a new water heater, for example. So if you are handy, I would take on as much of that as possible. If not, you can do a maintenance program, which we've done through Excel Energy on some of our properties. And I'm sure there's more maintenance programs. That's not the only one out there, but you pay a monthly fee. And then if something breaks, the tenant would actually call someone else besides you. And, and that maintenance company would handle the repair. That works out pretty well. Or find a good handy person, someone that understands you're a landlord just getting into this and you don't want to pay $200 an hour to fix an outlet or whatever. You want to get someone who charges maybe $50 to $75 an hour, and they're willing to work after hours too.
I'm just going to note that you can find handymen or handy people in a number of different ways. And one of them is an app called TaskRabbit. And then there's Thumbtack also, I think. But there are ways because when you say that, my first thought is, I don't know any handy people. So where do I find them? And when I've lived alone, it's been very useful to know those apps. How do you keep good tenants and how do you avoid vacancies?
I think it's really two main things, Peter. Number one would be just keeping the rent fair. Increasing rents every 6 months or every year or every time a lease is up, I think is you're going to lose some good tenants doing that. Of course, you're going to give up a little bit of profit to keep a good tenant. And so what we've done over the years is we keep the rent extremely competitive when we have a good tenant. I'm not raising rents usually when we submit a new lease, and we're trying to get them to just commit to staying. That way I don't lose that good tenant. And then the second thing would be when there is a problem to like handle it immediately. I always tell my tenants when a big problem arises, again, water heater would be a good example. I always tell them, I'm like, listen, obviously I can't replace a water heater in 30 minutes. This is something that's going to be like a day or so that we'll get this done, maybe 24 hours. And then I always remind them, I'm like, you're not absolved of the problems of home ownership, right? If you're living in a home and the water heater breaks, you're not absolved of that problem. You're just absolved of the cost of that problem. And so I like to remind my tenants of that. But good rent prices, fair rent prices, and then fixing things as soon as you're aware of them would be the two things.
What's the biggest financial mistake that a new landlord should avoid?
Yeah, it kind of circles back to that first question, Peter. It's not screening for a good tenant. And so the screening process and the expectations for the tenant would be my biggest recommendation here. Again, I have, I have screened for tenants that have moved in on, let's say, November 1st, and we take their damage deposit and their first month's rent, and they don't pay December 1st, and they just wait for me to evict them. And so, and again, it's expensive to evict and it can be timely. So that would be the biggest issue is not screening to get a good tenant.
And what about pets? The popularity of pets is growing really rapidly. How do you deal with renters that want to bring pets?
Yeah, I'm usually good with pets. I think it's smart to have a pet limit. Maybe you're allowing two pets maximum or something like that, and not allowing them to have 5 dogs running around. I also think it's important to have breed restrictions. Most homeowners insurance policies aren't going to cover a dog bite if it's like a specific type of breed. I'm not super knowledgeable on some of this stuff, but really, I do restrict the type of pet people are having. But otherwise, it's good, and you can get like a pet deposit non-refundable. So maybe you're getting an extra $500 or $1,000 non-refundable pet deposit. You could do an increased rent amount sometimes. So I like pets. It's fine.
Okay, I really appreciate all this. Any last piece of advice you'd want to give to a new landlord?
Yeah, I think this video is maybe sounds like a little somber, like, oh, here's what I worry about, or here's some of the issues. But at the end of the day, I do think everyone should own a rental. And so it's one of those things where do your best not to be too fearful of what we're talking about. Screen for good tenants, keep the property maintained, and start collecting rent. And when you do that for 10 or 15 or 20 years, you're going to be very happy that you did.
And I've heard from you over and again how it can be one of the best investments somebody can have. And so your somber tone is about being serious about it. You just have to be serious. It's not just a, walk in the park. You need to focus on this. But if you do, and you get proficient at being a landlord, it's one of the best investments that a person can have. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree. Uh, as an example, real estate in the Twin Cities has appreciated 35% since 2019. And that's like 5 years ago, I think. And so 6 years ago. So you're looking at, you buy a $200,000 home then, and 30% of that is what, $70,000 or something like that. So the equity appreciation is pretty awesome when it happens, and it doesn't always happen. But also you get the equity payoff, or the principal reduction, I should say. And again, a 3-year plan being a landlord, probably not a great idea. 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, it's hard to beat the investment.
All right. Great advice, as always, Travis. I want to really thank you for taking the time to share all this with us today. And to everybody out there, if you've got any questions or comments, leave it in the comments below. Thanks.
We